"That's a pretty faded piece of ink you've got there, old-timer," the young airman said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You win that in a bar fight." His friend, equally young and clad in the same airman battle uniform, snickered. Joe Rogers, 81 years old and leaning on his cart in the base commissary, simply looked down at the faded tattoo on his forearm. It was a simple design, a stylized bird of prey, wings outstretched, with a single cryptic number beneath it. He didn't answer. He just adjusted his grip on the cart, the knuckles on his hand white but steady. The first airman, emboldened by the silence, leaned closer. "Seriously, what is that? Some kind of garage band logo from the 60s. The commissary was beginning to fill up with the lunchtime crowd, a mix of uniforms and civilian families. The airmen's voices, sharp with the casual cruelty of youth, carried easily over the low hum of refrigeration units and distant checkout beeps. Joe felt the prickle of eyes on him. He had just wanted to pick up a few groceries, maybe a rotisserie chicken for dinner. He hadn't expected an interrogation. He ran a thumb over the worn skin of his arm, the lines of the tattoo now soft and blurred by 8 decades of life. The ink was a part of him, as integral as the slight stoop in his shoulders or the web of lines around his piercing blue eyes. He had lived with it for so long that he often forgot it was there, until moments like this. "Come on, Pops, we're just curious," the second airman chimed in, stepping to block Joe's path. "You served? Is that what it's supposed to be? Because my drill sergeant would have had a fit if we showed up with ink like that." He pointed at the clean, sharp lines of a tribal design peeking out from under his own sleeve. "Gotta meet regs, you know." The condescension was a physical thing, an invisible pressure in the air. Joe finally lifted his gaze from his arm and met the young man's eyes. His own were clear, steady, and held a depth that seemed to momentarily unnerve the airman. There was no anger in them, no fear. There was just a profound weariness, a quiet acceptance that some things would never change. He had seen this same unthinking arrogance in the eyes of second lieutenants fresh out of the academy, convinced they knew everything about a world they had only just entered. He had seen it in the faces of Saigon officials who smiled while they lied. It was a tale as old as time. "It's just something from a long time ago," Joe said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was softer than the airman might have expected. "If you'll excuse me." He tried to maneuver his cart around them, but they shifted, a practiced, almost choreographed movement of casual intimidation. The first airman put a hand on Joe's cart, stopping it cold. The gesture was a clear escalation, a transition from verbal needling to physical assertion. A few shoppers nearby paused, their conversations faltering. A mother with 2 young children pulled them a little closer. The atmosphere in the aisle, once mundane, was now thick with a gathering tension. "We're not done here," the first airman said, his smirk fading into a more hardened expression. "A lot of guys walk around this base pretending to be something they're not. It's called stolen valor, and we take that very seriously." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Joe's hand tightened on the cart handle. His gaze flickered past the airman, taking in the scene with a practiced economy of vision that had once been the difference between life and death. He saw the nervous faces in the crowd, the way people tried to look without looking. He saw the concern on the face of an older woman in the next aisle, and the indecision on the face of a young captain who was watching from a distance, clearly unsure whether to intervene. The second airman, not to be outdone, puffed out his chest. "Yeah, we do. So why don't you tell us what that tattoo means? Which unit? What years? Shouldn't be too hard if the story's real." They were feeding off each other, a feedback loop of bravado and perceived authority. To them, Joe was just a stooped old man, a relic whose quiet nature they mistook for weakness. They couldn't see the steel that lined his spine, forged in pressures they couldn't possibly imagine. They saw faded ink and wrinkled skin, not the silent promise that lay beneath it. Joe remained silent, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated reluctance to unlock the box where those memories were kept. Opening it, even a crack, would let the ghosts out, and the commissary aisle was no place for ghosts. His silence only served to fuel their certainty. "See, he can't even answer," the first one said, turning to his friend with a triumphant sneer. "I knew it, just another phony." He then looked back at Joe, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "Maybe we should get security forces over here. They can sort this out." The threat of involving the military police was the final straw for many of the onlookers. Whispers turned into murmurs. The young captain finally seemed to make a decision, taking a hesitant step forward, but he was too far away to intervene immediately. The airmen were closing in, their postures aggressive, their faces flushed with the thrill of their self-appointed crusade. Joe Rogers stood his ground, a small, quiet island in a storm of their making, his mind 1,000,000 miles and 50 years away. A flicker of memory, sharp and unwanted, broke through his composure. Not a thought, but a sensation. The acrid smell of burning jet fuel, the scream of an engine, the concussive whump of an explosion that vibrated through the very marrow of his bones. He felt a phantom heat on his skin, saw a flash of orange against a backdrop of suffocating green jungle. He saw a friend's face, young and terrified, mouthing a name. His name. The tattoo on his arm seemed to burn, a sudden searing heat that was purely imaginary but felt intensely real. It was the memory of the needle, a makeshift tool sterilized in whiskey and flame, piercing his skin in a stuffy, humid tent while the war raged on outside. It was the memory of a blood oath, a pact made by men who knew they were unlikely to see home again, a promise to remember, a promise to carry the story of the one who didn't make it back. The number under the bird was not a unit designation. It was a name, a life, a final mission. This flash, this echo of a forgotten inferno, lasted only a second, but it was enough to change the light in Joe's eyes. The weariness was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a flicker of the fire that had forged him. The airmen didn't notice the change, too caught up in their own performance, but a man standing near the end of the aisle did. He was a chief master sergeant, his uniform crisp, his face a roadmap of decades of service. He had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of unease. He didn't recognize the old man, but he recognized the look in his eyes. It was a look he had seen in the eyes of his own father, a veteran of a different, colder war. It was the look of a man who had walked through hell and had no interest in describing the journey, and the chief had seen the tattoo. He didn't know its specific meaning, but he knew it was old school, not the polished artistic ink of the modern military, but something rougher, more personal, something that reeked of authenticity. He watched the junior airmen threaten to call security, their chests puffed out, and his jaw tightened. This was not what the uniform stood for. This was bullying, plain and simple. He saw the discomfort rippling through the crowd, the shame that was starting to mix with the tension. He knew he had to do something, but a public dressing down of two young airmen might only make the situation worse for the old man, drawing even more unwanted attention. He needed a different tool, a bigger hammer. Quietly, so as not to draw attention, the chief pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name for a moment before he pressed it. The call was answered on the second ring. "Sir, Chief Evans here," he said, his voice low but urgent, turning his back to the unfolding drama. "My apologies for calling you directly, but we have a situation developing at the base commissary." He paused, listening. "No, sir, no immediate danger, but it's unseemly. A couple of my younger airmen are publicly harassing an elderly veteran." He described the scene in clipped, efficient sentences. He described Joe's calm demeanor, the airmen's escalating aggression, the tattoo at the center of the conflict. He described the accusation of stolen valor. "I don't know him, sir," the chief continued, "but there's something about him, the way he carries himself. And the ink, it's an eagle or a hawk of some kind. Underneath it, the number, 27. He listened again, his own eyes widening slightly at the response from the other end of the line. "Yes, sir, that's what I said. Number 27. Okay. Yes, I understand. I'll keep an eye on things. They won't lay a hand on him." "Yes, sir." He hung up the phone, a look of profound gravity settling on his face. He turned back to watch the scene, no longer just a concerned observer, but the advance guard for a force he knew was about to be unleashed. He slid his phone back into his pocket and began to walk slowly, deliberately toward the confrontation. His instructions were clear: keep the peace and wait for the cavalry. Inside a wood-paneled office in the command building across the base, General Marcus Thorne stood up from his desk, the phone still in his hand. He was a 4-star general, the commander of the entire Air Combat Command, a man whose days were a meticulously scheduled ballet of briefings, video conferences, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in assets. A dispute in the commissary was so far beneath his pay grade it was practically subterranean. But Chief Evans was not one to make frivolous calls, and the name combined with the description of the tattoo had hit him like a physical blow. "Get me my car," he said to his executive officer, a young sharp-as-a-tack lieutenant colonel who was already on his feet, sensing the sudden seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. "And get my dress blues ready, now." The exec blinked. "Sir, you have the briefing with the congressional delegation in 30 minutes. General Thorne was already shrugging off his flight suit, his movements crisp and urgent. "Postpone it. Tell them something came up, something important." He looked his exec in the eye, his expression hard as granite. "Did you ever hear of Operation Nightingale, Colonel?" The exec shook his head. No, sir. I'm not familiar with it. Few are. It was classified for 40 years. Vietnam, the general said, his voice dropping. It was a deep insertion rescue operation, all volunteers. They flew heavily modified Sky Raiders, ancient props, into the hottest LZs imaginable to pull out downed pilots. Only a handful came home. He paused, his gaze distant. Each pilot had a number, a call sign, and each one had a tattoo inked on his arm, a bird of prey so they could identify the bodies. The number underneath was the call sign of the brother pilot they swore to protect, the one they would fly through hell to save, the man they were harassing in our commissary, the man with the number 27 tattoo. His name is Joe Rogers. He was Nightingale 1. The color drained from the lieutenant colonel's face. My God, the exec whispered. God has very little to do with it, Colonel, General Thorne said, his voice tight with a cold fury. This is about us. This is about who we are, and what we remember. Now get that car. I'm not going to have a living legend, a man who taught my own father how to fly, be humiliated by children wearing my uniform. Back in the fluorescent-lit aisle, the two airmen had reached the peak of their arrogance. They now stood on either side of Joe, effectively trapping him. The first one had his phone out, pretending to dial the security forces. Last chance, old man, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. Tell us the truth about that tattoo, or you can explain it to the cops. We can have you escorted off this base for impersonating a veteran. It was an absurd, empty threat, but it was the final insult. Joe finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he spoke more than a few words. His voice was still quiet, but it was layered with an ancient authority that cut through the airman's bluster. Son, Joe said, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're standing here, in this uniform, in this country, enjoying a peace you